This podcast contains adult themes and graphic violence. Listener discretion is advised.
A commercial-free version of this podcast is available on Patreon for $1 per month. Patreon.com/Beyond Contempt Podcast. Just some quick housekeeping. The podcast will be on a tighter schedule for 2022, with twice-a-month releases on the second and fourth Wednesday of every month. I'm Renee, and this is Beyond Contempt True Crime. Last episode, we had 2 cases of murderous professors. In this episode, we are turning the tables and have a case of 2 professors who were really tremendous people that were murdered by high school students who harbored delusional fantasies about their future. You're listening to episode 50, The Zantops. John Parker was from Poughkeepsie, New York, and his wife Joan was from San Diego, California. The Parkers wanted to move, and they randomly picked the town of Chelsea, Vermont, with a population of just over 1,000. It was a 30-minute drive to the nearest highway. Joan Parker was a racquetball instructor. John attended Ohio Wesleyan University, where he learned carpentry. He had a close connection to the Chelsea community. John had a hand in building and renovating many homes in the small town. He built one of Chelsea's picnic shelters and was on the Chelsea Recreation Committee, where he manicured the lawn on the south side of town. Their son, Jim, was 16 years old and wasn't a very serious high school student. He earned a reputation for being the class clown and was always joking around with his classmates. Jim was adept at finding the humor in every situation. He did have a few hobbies. Jim liked to play the bass guitar for fun, and he loved snowboarding. There wasn't much going on in Chelsea, and there were few activities to keep young folks entertained. Luckily, Jim Parker had been in little trouble until that point, except for a few run-ins with law enforcement. Jim and his best friend, 17-year-old Robert Tulloch, were suspected in a breaking and entering case, but authorities did not file charges against them. Robert Tulloch was more serious about school than his friend Jim. Early in his senior year of high school, he had already fulfilled all the requirements for graduation. Classmates elected Robert to the student council as president, and he was an honor student. He was an excellent debater and was voted most likely to take over the world. Robert enjoyed sports, and his tall and thin body easily ran up and down the soccer field. His parents had moved to Vermont from Florida, and the family had lived in New England for about 9 years. Robert's father, Michael Tulloch, made furniture and specialized in Windsor chairs, which are the chairs with a wood seat and a rounded back with vertical rods that make up the backrest. Robert's mother, Diane, was a nurse with the Dartmouth Hitchcock Medical Center. She was a bit of a hippie in that she made her own soap and raised her own chickens. It wasn't destiny that brought Robert Tulloch and Jim Parker together, as much as there was only one school in the town. There were 325 students, from kindergarten to high school. It was not uncommon to only have 10 students in a grade. Hulf and Susanna lived in a charming house on a secluded lane close to the Dartmouth campus in Hanover, New Hampshire, and only lived 30 miles away from Robert Tulloch and Jim Parker. Hulf was born on April 24, 1938, in Eckernford, Germany. He earned his undergraduate degree in geology from Karl Ludwig University, and a year later earned another geology degree from Washington State University. Susanna Korsowitz was born on August 12, 1945, in Kissingen, Germany. She received her bachelor's degree in political science in 1967 from the Free University of Berlin. Susanna earned a scholarship to Stanford University for her master's. Hulf and Susanna were a couple when they attended Stanford. Susanna finished her master's in 1968, and Hulf finished his PhD in 1969. They moved to Argentina, where Hulf took a job. This was where the pair married, with the beautiful Andes Mountains in the backdrop. The Zantops lived in Colombia for a while. Then Half took a job in Spain. They had their first daughter, Veronica, and a few years later, their second daughter, Mariana, came along. Susanna taught German and literature while in Spain. Half wanted to spend more time with his family, so he moved from industry to academia and took a research fellowship at the University of Heidelberg. Half was presented with an opportunity to teach at Dartmouth, and the whole family moved across the ocean to the United States. At Dartmouth, Half taught geology and earth science classes. Susanna raised her daughters for the first few years, but then got a second master's degree from the University of Massachusetts in Amherst. In 1984, she received her PhD from Harvard University in comparative literature. During this time, she was also teaching at Dartmouth. The Zantops were a powerhouse through the 80s and the 90s. Susanna taught German classes and chaired the faculty in the German department. She edited and authored several books. Susanna was published in many journals and was a speaker who was always in demand. Half co-wrote a book and was always voted one of the top teachers at Dartmouth. He would take his students on geology field trips to places like Mexico, and many of the college kids struggled to keep up with him when they were in the field. Half was absolutely beloved by his students. In 2000, the Zantops started their retirement planning and decided they didn't want to spend too many more years working. There were endless trips the Zantops wanted to take since they had many friends all around the world. Their friends described the couple as warm-hearted and outgoing. The Zantops were quick to share their home with anyone. These extraordinary qualities of being open and welcoming were likely what landed the Zantops in trouble on January 27, 2001. High school students Robert Tulloch and Jim Parker knocked on the door of the Zantop residence. Half Zantop answered the door and invited the two young men inside. The boys were doing a research survey for their school. Susanna was busy in the kitchen, prepping for dinner, since they were having company that evening. Half Zantop was not impressed with the lack of preparedness of the boys with their questionnaire, and told them as much. This criticism angered Robert Tulloch, and when Half turned away for a moment, Tulloch pulled out his foot-long combat knife and repeatedly stabbed Half in the chest and the face. He conducted the assault with such intensity that Tulloch stabbed his own leg above the right knee. Susanna heard the struggle and ran from the kitchen to save her husband. Parker stabbed her at Tulloch's command. Tulloch joined in and stabbed her in both the head and the body. The boys grabbed money from Half's wallet and fled. That evening, the Zantops' dinner guest arrived at their house. She was both a friend and a colleague of the couple. She walked into a horrific situation where her good friends, Half and Susanna, had been stabbed to death. Law enforcement was quickly called. The Hanover Police Department was a small outfit, so they had to call in the New Hampshire State Police Major Crimes Unit to help. They were much more experienced in handling murders. After all, the death of Half and Susanna Zantop was only the third murder case witnessed in 50 years in Hanover. Right away, they noticed that there was no sign of forced entry, so police presumed the victims knew the perpetrators or were comfortable with them. There was some amount of struggle. Someone had tipped tables and chairs over in the scuffle. The contents of a trash can were strewn around the room. A throw rug had been pulled out of place and was upturned. There wasn't much taken from the home. A bloody footprint was left by the fireplace. They left 2 tactical-style knife cases on the ground. Fingerprints were collected, but nothing matched law enforcement's database. The FBI aided with investigation and performed an analysis on the boot print. Officers said that the most disturbing aspect about the crime was the pure violence and overkill with the number of times the victims were stabbed. Susanna was stabbed 11 times, and Half was stabbed 10, plus throats had been slit. The initial thoughts were this was a crime of passion because of the level of violence. Maybe Half was having an affair that went south. Police quickly dispelled this notion after they interviewed the Zantops circle of friends and family. Investigators then found out that a student had an argument with Health. When the student was tracked down and interviewed, police saw that he had an abrasion of some sort. But further investigation revealed that the student had a solid alibi. Once investigators interviewed more students, it turned out there wasn't an argument after all. It was a misunderstanding. Police set up a task force and received all kinds of tips via phone, email, and letter. The tips grew to the level where they stopped being helpful, since so many people reported in with all kinds of stories and far-fetched theories. Early the next week, Parker sold his bass guitar, amp, saxophone, and snowbird. Tulloch had the $340 from Half Zantops' wallet. Combined, they had $800, and used this seed money to hatch their cross-country escape. They took off on a Wednesday and told friends they were heading west to Colorado for a rock climbing adventure. Parker and Tulloch drove to the bus station. They wanted to travel to a warm place and tried to buy a bus ticket to Syracuse, California. The employee working the ticket window had to tell them that Syracuse, California wasn't a city that existed. Tulloch and Parker borrowed the ticket clerk's atlas and decided on Amarillo, Texas, since the $139 ticket price was within their budget. They boarded the bus, and by the following night they were already uncomfortable on the crowded transportation. Plus, they were already getting low on money. The boys called their parents by the time they hit St. Louis, Missouri. Their parents were upset and wanted them home. They flew the boys back to New Hampshire. News of the murder spread quickly, and it put the community on edge because murder was not something that happened there. A week later, a memorial service for Susanna and Half was held at Dartmouth's Rollins Chapel. There were 700 people who paid their respects. The Zantops daughters thanked everyone who attended and started a circle of light ceremony. Each person held a candle, which signified the impact that the Zantops had on family and friends. They were such an amazing couple who illuminated the lives of those around them. We're going to take a quick break to hear from our sponsor. Thank you to Hunt a Killer for sponsoring this episode of Beyond Contempt True Crime. My birthday is coming up soon, and so is Valentine's Day. Am I going to go to a crowded restaurant? No, I'm not. I'm going to stay home and solve a murder when I play Hunt a Killer. Did you already binge all of your true crime shows you had on your Hulu watch list, like I did? Then it's time for the rubber to meet the road. Put your skills to the test and try solving a cold case yourself. You know, Hunt a Killer isn't just about solving a murder. This game tells an immersive story, the same kind of stories that I cover on my podcast. You'll learn about the backstories for each of the suspects, their complicated relationships to the victim, and watch everything unfold as you complete each episode. What I appreciate is part of the proceeds for every box go to the Cold Case Foundation, an organization that is dedicated to helping with real-life cold cases. That's 2 thumbs up in my book. Right now, you can go to huntakiller.com/beyond and use the code BEYOND for $10 off your order. Again, that's code BEYOND for a $10 discount. Now, back to the show. On February 14, 2001, police made progress on the case when they discovered a company called Fox Firearms purchased a significant number of Seal 2000 knives, which matched the knife cases that were left in the Zantops home. The company told law enforcement that they sold 84 knives over the internet and provided a list of customer names. These 84 knives were sold to 83 customers, with one customer who had purchased 2 of those knives. The buyer's username was Jimmy Bruce, and the name of the customer was Jim Parker. Police went to question Parker the next day. He told authorities he bought the knives over the internet so he and his friend Robert Tulloch could each have one. Parker said he sold the knives to a customer in an Army-Navy store because they were not suitable for camping since they were too bulky. Police asked Parker if he would consent to being fingerprinted. He agreed, along with his father's blessing. Detectives headed over to see Robert Tulloch. He provided the same story about the knives as Jim Parker had. Law enforcement noticed the cut on his leg. Tulloch explained it away and told them that he cut it on a maple tree spigot. They asked Tulloch if they could see his footwear. He went upstairs and grabbed his vast hiking boots, then presented them to the detectives. They asked Tulloch if they could take the boots, and he agreed, not wanting to plant any seeds of doubt with law enforcement. Tulloch also agreed to fingerprinting and caught sight of Jim Parker at the sheriff's office, who he figured was engaging in the same exercise. The police could not detain the boys, even though they suspected they were guilty. There was not enough concrete evidence. Officers, however, had a difficult time envisioning that two high school-age boys could commit such a brutal crime. Tulloch and Parker called each other that night and decided they needed another escape plan. On February 16, 2001, the boys met up, and Parker drove them to the interstate. Tulloch admitted to Parker that he forgot to grab the knives, which he had stored in his bedroom. If police produced a search warrant, they would have the evidence needed to tie them to the murder. They didn't want to risk driving back home and getting caught. Parker's father heard his son start up his car when he left. He ran into his son's room and found a note that Jim had penned. It said, "I just had to talk to Robert alone. I will be back in the morning. Don't call the cops." John Parker eventually called the police once morning rolled around and his son had not returned. As Parker and Tulloch were driving along the interstate, they realized police would look for their car. They ditched Parker's vehicle and were going to hitchhike their way across the country to California. Later on, the car would be found covered in snow at a truck stop in Sturbridge, Massachusetts. The employees remembered the two boys in backpacks, asking truck drivers for rides. They were picked up by a truck driver who got on his CB radio and announced he had two boys in need of a ride to California. What Tulloch and Parker didn't realize was that the police were monitoring the airwaves. An officer posing as a truck driver radioed back and said that he could take the boys the rest of the way. The trucker dropped the boys off at a Flying J in Newcastle, Indiana, where the police were waiting to arrest them. After a judge signed the search warrants, it didn't take long for police to make their way to Tulloch's bedroom. The murder weapons were tucked inside a Florida citrus box, hiding underneath a bunch of magazines. The blades lacked the cases and were wrapped in foam that was held in place with duct tape. When law enforcement tested the knives, they found traces of blood on the weapons, which matched Susanna Zantops' DNA. Parker's fingerprint matched a print found on one of the knife cases left behind at the crime scene. The floor mats of Parker's car were tested, and they also matched Susanna Zantops' DNA. A fingerprint was left on one of the chairs in the Zantops home, and it matched Tulloch. His vast hiking boot exactly matched the bloody print at the crime scene. They charged Robert Tulloch and James Parker with the murders. Everyone from the community knew who the boys were and wondered how this could have happened. The town even offered free counseling for anyone who needed it. The prosecution worked out an agreement with Jim Parker by the end of 2001. He agreed to plead guilty to being an accomplice to the second-degree murder of Susanna Zantop, and he would receive a shorter sentence in return. He would also need to testify against his best friend, Robert Tulloch. The boys were bored with the small town of Chelsea. Tulloch and Parker talked about becoming Navy SEALs, but it seemed like too much work. They wanted to become something different, like hired assassins. The boys wanted to become cool people and wanted to travel to Egypt to check out if the myths were true. Reality wasn't a place the boys existed in, and they fantasized about living forever. They didn't want the status quo, and certainly didn't want to go to university. Tulloch thought his peers were wasting much of their lives pursuing education. Tulloch and Parker wanted to steal $10,000, so they could begin a new life. Expatriation to Australia seemed desirable. A crafty person could just live outside on the beaches or in the desert. When they were in the planning stages, they discussed all kinds of methods to get money. Identity theft, credit card fraud, stealing ATVs. They wanted the money quickly, and committing small-time crimes garnered little cash, so they had to think bigger. In summer 2000, the boys were driving home from a festival in Sugarbush and came up with the idea to commit a more violent crime. Parker said it was Tulloch who decided that they should steal credit and debit cards, then kill the victims because they couldn't risk witnesses who might identify them. Tulloch thought he should practice killing before he actually committed the real deal, and even considered killing his dog for practice. Parker was against this. Parker said that they both admired Adolf Hitler and thought he was a smart and masterful manipulator. Perhaps they believed that they were smarter than others and could also be masterful manipulators. Parker and Tulloch arrogantly thought that they would figure it all out as they went along. The Dartmouth campus was nice and looked expensive to the boys, so it seemed that there could be reasonable targets in the area. Tulloch and Parker tried to break into homes several times over the 6-month period leading up to the murders. On July 19, 2000, the duo targeted a residence in Vershire, Vermont, and cut the phone lines. To prepare for the murder, Tulloch dug a large hole in a field not far away from the residence to bury the victims after he killed them. Parker hid in the bushes as Tulloch went to the front door and tried to pitch a story about having car issues. The owner had a gun and immediately shut Tulloch down. After this, the boys made up a fake environmental survey to gain access to households. They tried this at a residence in Rochester, Vermont, and it didn't work out. The duo tried another home in Etna, New Hampshire, and that didn't work out. They ordered stun guns from an internet store, but Tulloch's mother put a stop to it and sent the weapons back. Tulloch and Parker turned to the internet again, and this time purchased large tactical knives used to kill the Zantops. Parker hesitated prior to the assault because Half seemed like a nice guy. Parker told the prosecution that they shouldn't have killed him, but Tulloch took the lead, and Parker took prompts from Tulloch without question. He admitted to slitting Susanna's throat when Tulloch told him to. Parker spoke with a hint of regret, but his lament seemed to revolve around the fact that he got caught, and it was only for $340. It was only then that Parker decided he didn't want to kill people for money. The realization that law enforcement could catch them never factored into their plan. After the murder, the pair used the New Hampshire snow to wash both their hands and the knives when they fled the house, but they made the grave mistake of leaving the knife cases behind. When they reconvened and discussed the next steps, they decided if it came down to killing a police officer, they would go there. Then they hatched their 2 escape attempts, the second of which ended up in their arrest. When Parker entered his plea with the court, tears ran down his face. Jim Parker struggled to find words, said he was sorry, and frequently looked at his parents for reassurance. Tulloch planned to use an insanity plea, but scrapped the idea since a psychiatrist would not classify him as mentally ill. He pleaded guilty to the murders. Tulloch only emanated coldness when the Zantops daughters gave their victim impact statement. Tulloch's response was 180 degrees from Parker's, and many speculated that the New Hampshire justice system had a psychopath on their hands. Veronica Zantop was 29 years old and was a physician who lived in Seattle, Washington. She said, "There's no statement in the entire world that can capture the absolute horror, disbelief, pain, sadness, and anger that my sister, my family, and friends have experienced since the murders." Her sister Mariana was 27 and was a human rights worker. She stood by her sister's side in solidarity and support. James Parker received 25 years to life. He was eligible for parole after 16 years. He also agreed that the profits from any deals he received for books or movies would go to the Zantops children. They sentenced Robert Tulloch to life in prison without the possibility of parole. He made no further statements. The Tulloch family left the courthouse without giving an interview. The Parkers said a few quick words. John Parker said, "Joan and we'd like to say to Health and Susanna Zantops' family and friends, Veronica and Mariana, and everybody, we're very, very sorry." Joan Parker said, "We hope over time, those hurt by these acts will be able to find peace in their hearts and forgiveness." Jim Parker went to the New Hampshire State Prison in Concord. He was considered a medium security prisoner and was allowed the freedom to move throughout the prison until nightly lockdown. The guards stated that Parker was well behaved. He kept busy with yoga, guitar, and he took part in plays. After serving 2/3 of his sentence, Parker filed a motion to cut his prison time short. His rationale was he had been a model prisoner. Parker finished his master's degree and had been a mentor to other prisoners. The prosecution opposed his early release. The Zantops daughters were also against his premature departure. Parker withdrew his motion based on the family's wishes, not wanting to cause them more pain. Parker's first parole eligibility is May 2024. Robert Tulloch started out at the prison in Concord, but was transferred to Northern New Hampshire Correctional Facility in Berlin. He started off his time there being uncooperative. Tulloch also didn't get along with his fellow inmates and was attacked shortly after he arrived. Word got back to prison officials that he was planning an escape. In September 2002, they sent Tulloch back to Concord, the same prison that housed Jim Parker. Tulloch spent much of his first 2 years in lockdown. By most reports, the two former best friends have minimal contact in prison, even though they eat in the same cafeteria. In 2012, the U.S. Supreme Court decided that sentencing a juvenile to life without parole was unconstitutional. This ruling was driven by scientific studies that showed juvenile brains were not fully formed, and they have a better chance of being reformed, along with diminished culpability. In August 2014, the Supreme Court decided that Robert Tulloch's case would be reviewed. His case was on hold as of 2021. 2021 also marked the 20-year anniversary of the loss of the beloved couple, Health and Susanna Zantop. The Dartmouth community paid tribute to the Zantops with flowers and candles. They even named a campus garden after them in remembrance. Thank you so much for joining me for this episode of Beyond Contempt. Please visit beyondcontemptpodcast.com for the links to the sources and music used in this episode. Research, writing, editing, audio production, and sound design were performed by me, Renee. And I want to thank patron Steve Z. Thank you for supporting the show. If you like the show, please leave me a positive review on Apple Podcasts. Thank you so much, everyone.